Well, that was fascinating and really eye-opening for me in many ways. I guess I would like to start with a question that people keep asking me, and really the question that inspired the exhibition that I did, which is, how has photographic manipulation changed from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st century? Are there things that you can do with retouching, digital retouching, that couldn't be done before? Are there different reasons for doing it? Is there a different approach to retouching? So I'm just going to throw that question out to the three of you, and see what I can learn from your responses and pass that on the next time I'm asked.
Well, I've only been in the industry for a little over a decade, but from the earlier part when I was first employed as a retoucher to now, I found that my clients are a lot more realistic, and they're willing to meet me more halfway. There's still some people who are very uneducated, and they're just like, you can do anything at anything, just do it. And I was like, you have to give me something to work with. So I find that now when there's a very difficult concept, people are trying to find that middle meeting point that's like a little bit closer to being more realistic, looking in the end, instead of it being more painting. There's a lot more of the actual photographs being used. So I'm being met halfway.
Any thoughts, Mark?
Well, I'm thinking that the original use for retouching was to compensate for the inherent fault of the medium. So if you have a process, as I was showing, that will photograph anything that is brown, tan, orange, yellow, pink as black, which are all the colors of our face, they didn't have a choice. They had to do something to make Caucasian people look Caucasian. And black people looked like polished ebony back then. Of course, they weren't coming into the studios like the white population was. So there was a real need to have people walk out of the studio happy. And they weren't in the beginning. They were coming out saying, why does my face look like leather? And they had to do something to fix that problem. So the act of reconstructive surgery, here you're actually trying to make a tan. In the 19th century, the tan didn't show that you were somebody that had some status.
It meant you worked in the fields.
It meant you worked in the field, and of course those people weren't coming in to get their pictures taken. So anytime that they had somebody with a dark skin, the poor photographers, they would look at this person. If you had a ruddy complexion, and worse, if you came in with a white linen jacket and a ruddy complexion, what do? You send them to the photographer down the street. It was much more difficult.
I don't think what I do involves retouching, though. I'm inventing realities, but it's more based on the fact that when I went to graduate school back in the 50s, there were very few places where you could have a studio emphasis of photography. So there was only 2 of us in the program that had art history PhD majors. And then for 10 years when I taught, there were no photographers. I was on an art faculty. So my main source of image inspiration came from all the art history classes I had. And that sort of freed me up in terms of ways of thinking about the art world, because the art historians were not talking about photography.
Right. Now, Jerry, you tried Photoshop. I remember in the 90s, you worked with Adobe on creating an image on the computer, using your scanned negatives. And you ultimately decided you weren't convinced. You decided to stay in the darkroom, to stick with your darkroom techniques. Right. Can you talk about why?
Well, the basic story is Adobe contacted me and offered what I considered a significant sum for an academic to make an image using Photoshop. And then they told us what equipment to buy. And then they sent someone. It was like the old days where you had this technical person. I'm sitting there just telling them what to do. But it involved computer skills, which I did not have. You know, and we eventually created an image, and they made a wonderful poster out of it. And, you know, once that got out in the world, everybody was calling me like I'd switched. But the darkroom is an inherent part of my creative process now. There's ways in which you're addressing this image as it emerges in the developer, and you're constantly going through mental gymnastics of, you know, what does it mean? What am I thinking about here? And then you're also dealing with craft issues. And that's something you don't get on the computer. Now, what really happened, it launched my wife's career in the digital world, because once the fellow that set it up and helped make the image left, she read the manual, which was this thick back then, and it began to influence her work. Once he left, I went in the darkroom and created that same image. And, you know, they're very similar, except with Photoshop, tiny little zits that would occur, you know, could be retouched. But I just realized that the darkroom is very much an integral part of my process.
I think that, you know, when I think of Jerry's work, when I was going to art school in the 70s, of course, I knew Jerry's work instantly. Everybody knew Jerry's work. And now that I'm a process historian, I look back at all those composite pictures that were made, you know, like the German photographers would take individual pictures of all the soldiers and then do a composite where they put them into a scene that those people had never seen before. That sort of work was done a fair amount of time in the 19th century to put people where they had never been.
Right.
And Jerry is, of course, blending these images to create realities that don't exist. It's really very much the same thing. It's just that, you know, how he does it is.
Well, the amazing thing about this exhibit, of course, is that, believe me, first of all, back in the late 50s, you could read every book on serious photography in the weekend. There was no problem. But this material was not accessible. Even when they dealt with the Bauhaus, you'd get to see a few of the experimental things in Hartfield occasionally. But there's that long tradition that now there's an awareness that hopefully people appreciate that it has been around for a long time.
What about the role of manual craft? Manual craft was very important in the 19th century in terms of, you know, creating photo montages and, you know, working with paper negatives and glass negatives. Is manual craft still important in the digital age?
I think I'm on the cusp of when people started using computers as far as like learning in art school, and I still firmly believe like in having that kind of background. I think the discipline is, I know I mentioned before, but I still think the discipline is an extremely important thing to have. And if you're very like determined to make something, you're not just going to be happy with anything. You're the easy way out.
Mm-hmm.
But you started with some handwork with light tables and applying.
No, actually, I don't have a photo background at all. I have a painting background.
Okay.
And so I don't even really separate photos and paintings so much. I just think everything's an image. Mm-hmm. And so Photoshop's just one tool I can use to work on an image. If I want to do a picture of this table with these glasses, I have a choice if I could draw it. I could draw it on the computer. I can take a photo. I can create it in Photoshop using that as a drawing tool too.
Yeah.
So would drawing and painting then be almost a prerequisite for? I mean, I know there are lots of people who don't.
I don't think it has to be, but I know a handful of people in the industry that wish they had better drawing skills. Mm-hmm. There are certain ways you can dissect an image, and when you take off certain layers of one of my files, you can still see a drawing of a person because I'm kind of painting shadows and highlights, and you can sort of see this negative shape of someone. And when I look at my friends' files, it's very like more stick figure-y. And so the eye-hand coordination is still an important part.
I mean, I know that when I work on my images that are continuous multiple exposures in the camera, sometimes I have to sketch them out because they're all self-portraits. Yeah. And so I have to figure out where I'm going to be and where I'm going to go next. And so the sketching of it actually is pretty important.
To me, well, one of the big differences, obviously, you work with a client, and so you have ongoing dialogue. In my case, I can tell you the creative process has a lot of self-doubt. I mean, I make these images. It helps if you're an anal retentive, compulsive workaholic, but I don't have any basis of, I'm not making it for a particular market. I'm trying to please myself, that it deals, I tried to, in the amount of time, suggest where some of these ideas and feelings come from, but it's basically the modernist aesthetic. You know, when we came from the 19th into the 20th century, went from outer-directed art that fulfilled the needs of the culture and the society and the patron to art that was much more personal. I'm part of that tradition of trying to create images that personally resonate with me and hopefully with another audience. But that's the last thing I'm thinking about at the time I'm working through that process.
Jerry, your photographs are convincing in terms of a kind of effective realism, and yet utterly impossible in some of the content in terms of what's happening. Do you think that people have gotten better at other images? In other images, that the fakery or the manipulation is more secretive. It's more. It's not meant to be perceived all at once. Do you think that people have gotten better at spotting photographic manipulation today than they used to be? And is this an effect of the ubiquity of software like Photoshop, or do you think that it's part of a greater visual literacy in our culture?
I think it goes both ways. Photoshop is very accessible, so if someone spends a lot of time with it, they can definitely make something where they're covering all their tracks and it's not very detectable, but it's also accessible to someone who doesn't know what they're doing, and they can make a mess, and then they put it on the internet and everyone sees it. And so I think in that way, like, I can't make a one answer, because there's a giant range from a novice user who just has an email address and posting things on the internet, and somebody who's slaving away by themselves and not showing their image to anyone.
Mm-hmm. Right, and in your work, there are some cases where, you know, the manipulation is obvious and fantastical and meant to be seen as altered in some way. And but in other cases, when it's maybe understood that there's been some retouching, but it's done in such a realistic way that you can't tell what was done. And I think that's an interesting sort of
I have
dichotomy.
to do both of those things sometimes in the same day even.
In my case, I feel the audience completes the process. And if the first question someone asks me is, how did you do that? I feel I failed. I don't want that to be the first response to that image. I want them to authentically, gee, that's strange, or that reminds me of a dream I had, or it makes me feel lonely, or, you know, an honest response. Later, if they ask, how did I do it, you know, it's fine, but that's like asking someone how they built that sentence. It doesn't, you know, explain the content of it.
Or asking someone who just drew a picture, like, how'd you do that? It's
Yeah.
like, I used a pencil. Like,
Right.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, people in the 19th century, when they looked at photographs with skies added to them, did they know that that was going on in the darkroom? And if they did know, did they care?
I don't think they really knew. I think that in the beginning, you know, there is this, we know, we have an expectation of what a photograph is, but if you've never seen one before, and who was making those big photographs of landscapes? Who saw Carleton Watkins pictures, or William Henry Jackson, or Muybridge? Who saw that stuff? And I think that there's a level of believability if they saw a whisper of some kind of a cloud, whether it's done with a smudge of the finger or whether it's a cloud negative. I think they're willing to believe what they saw. It's a little less critical than we're jaded now. You know, we expect everything to be manipulated. I suspect that probably there are more manipulated photographs on Match.com than any other source.
some of them are poorly done.
Yeah.
Like that big black blob who is your ex-girlfriend.
And do you think, are there any circumstances in which you feel that photographic manipulation is not appropriate, some line that shouldn't be crossed?
Well, in X-rays.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If you look at these pictures that were done by Chuck Close and Kate Moss, which go beyond what we might think is the truth, and show you every single flaw, which is really the sense of that work. And yesterday I went to the Haupt Gallery and looked at Sally Mann's ambrotypes there, which are self-portraits, where there are people going out of the way to show the imperfect body, the imperfect skin. We're going actually two different directions right now. There are two different artistic directions. We expect to see Photoshop. We expect to see things cleaned up, and now there's a little bit of backlash in the fine art world to show something that is the less perfect.
And do you ever get criticized? I know there's been a lot of controversy about the perfection of fashion models, making people look thinner in magazines, creating unrealistic body images and levels of perfection that real people can't live up to. I mean, how do you respond to those kinds of ideas?
I think in my mind I expect to be approached more often with people attacking me for that, but I've gotten like one hate mail from somebody who pinned that giant problem on me alone, and I was like, look, I'm the nice one, like I'm the one who's trying to like hold tight to like a little bit of authenticity. But one of my arguments I make is that anorexia probably existed before photography. People were comparing each other. A girl will compare herself to the girl standing next to her, and she didn't need to see a picture to have that psychological
I'm curious, have
problem.
you ever been asked to add flaws? I mean, here, put a birthmark here, or make them a little heavier. Have you ever had a client?
These are negotiable.
They're too perfect.
Some people like bigger butts, but I'm not sure if that's a flaw or an
that's
asset.
not quite that. I'm thinking a few blocks from here, my wife and I were walking past a window, and there were mannequins, and one of them actually looked more like a real person. It was actually a little heavier.
Well, I think that happens in casting. If they want a real person, they cast a real person. In the example of the old woman shot, I was angry that I had to do that image because there's some magazine that assumed that I am just competing with myself at home, trying to make myself do crazy things like make an old woman look young. And so they're like, don't you just have something?
There are plenty of young women out there.
I was like, don't they have something on hand in your computer? I was like, no, because if they want a young, pretty woman on a cover, they hire a young, pretty woman to be the model. And so, unless it's just a creative challenge, which is what that image was for.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot from all three of your talks. I'd like to invite you and the audience to go upstairs and take a look at both exhibitions, Faking It and After Photoshop. There's also an interactive app that we've created in which you are challenged to figure out if a photograph was faked, and if so, why. And that app is available in the galleries and also online at iTunes, and there's a link on the museum's website. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our speakers.